Welcome, comrades. You're listening to The Party Line, a podcast from The Ditch, news and comment from Ireland on theditch.com. I'm Harry Browne.
And I'm Niamh Bhriain, and you can follow The Party Line wherever you watch or listen to podcasts, and follow The Ditch on all of your apps, where you can also like and subscribe.
And, give us 5 stars, would you? We just noticed that there's still a few kind of hangover pain in the arses from a couple of years ago who didn't like the old Ditch podcast, and are keeping our numbers down on Apple Podcasts. So give us the 5 stars on Apple Podcasts, won't you, folks? I sat it out last week. So this is my first time in the sleek new Rosa Luxemburg studio. It's looking great. And we're joined by Eoghan McNeill from The Ditch. How you doing, Eoghan?
Not so bad. Thanks for having me.
It's great to see you again, man. And thanks for having us. And we are also joined by Nausicaa Renner from Dropsite News. We're releasing this episode on May Day. And of course, May Day, the International Workers' Holiday, originated in the aftermath of the Haymarket incident when police attacked a labor movement gathering in Chicago, USA, 1886. So we're joined from Chicago by Nausicaa Renner. Hi, Nausicaa.
Hi, solidarity forever.
Hi, Nausicaa. Yeah, so Nausicaa is the founding editor at one of our favorite publications, Dropsite News, and she's also a hugely experienced journalist, and she's the author of a fascinating article called Party and Class in the most recent New Left Review.
So it's lovely to have you here. Before we get talking to Nausicaa about Dropsite News, about the mesmerizing, spectacular state of American politics and the ongoing spectacle of Donald Trump and the people who would kill him if they got the chance, let's check in with, I guess, kind of Dropsite's equivalent publication here in Ireland, The Ditch. And there is some stories of American interest in The Ditch at the moment.
Yeah, a couple of Epstein-related stories.
Yeah. Tell us more.
Last week, there was a story of a lawyer from the US called Leah Safian, who was due to be coming to Ireland as part of a delegation from the California Lawyers Association, and she was going to be giving a talk at the Bar of Ireland, and this was circulated to members of the bar. Her talk was going, it specifically referred to witch hunts.
And she's Ghislaine Maxwell's lawyer.
She's Ghislaine Maxwell's lawyer.
Right.
She is, and in the description of the talk, it said that they did a kind of a 2016-ish kind of idpol take on Ghislaine Maxwell about how she's frequently depicted as a witch in the media and has been depicted as Cruella de Vil. And this lawyer of hers, Leah Safian, was going to be giving a talk about a habeas corpus writ that she filed on Ghislaine's behalf that would get her conviction overturned and get her released. And she was going to address the bar about this, and
the bar being a gathering of barristers.
Irish barristers, yeah. And Dean Buckley, shout out to Dean, who works with The Ditch. Always love working with Dean. And Dean, he went and he requested comment from the bar. He also requested comment. There was an Irish barrister who was going to be co-presenting with Leah Safian. The Irish barrister who was going to be co-presenting with her comes back to Dean and was like, Dean had asked him something along the lines of, will you be taking any steps to make sure that victims aren't defamed? And some of the question that was in and around was like the fact that she's Ghislaine Maxwell's lawyer. And the Irish barrister got back to Dean and just said, it would be inappropriate for me to comment on ongoing legal matters, while Safian is here to speak about those ongoing legal matters. Published a story, and I was cooking dinner on Friday, and Dean texted me and he was like, oh yeah, so it's been cancelled. The bar, Dean had asked them for comment, but the bar actually didn't send Dean the statement. They sent a statement to the Irish Times, which of course then led with the Bar of Ireland
cancels event.
But the socialist lawyers put out a really good statement expressing concern, which was, I think, really, they jumped into action really quickly as soon as they saw the Ditch story, and put out a statement saying, everyone is entitled to having a legal defence, and it's not about that, but they had like particular concerns around the title and the kind of notion of witch hunt, which was the title of the talk, actually. So they put out, the socialist lawyers put out a really good statement, which I think might have contributed as well to kind of building pressure around the event.
Yeah, and Rosa, the feminist group, they were planning a picket, and as you're saying, it's like, first off, to state the obvious, like the whole cab rank rule doesn't apply here. Like this was obviously a bit of a theme of Catherine Connolly's campaign, where the cab rank does apply. In this instance, no,
which
it doesn't.
Means that sometimes a lawyer represents somebody that they don't have any connection with. That's not the American way.
Yeah, and that's the first thing. And second of all, yes, of course, we separate lawyers from their clients. Thirdly, as well, I will hold the hands up and say I'm actually not a huge guy for like a no platforming thing. I mean, like just purely from a matter of strategy, like where I don't know. I think some of the no platforming stuff maybe back like 10 years ago. I remember we could debate the efficacy of, say, like someone like Milo Yiannopoulos being no platformed at Berkeley. Anyway, but like I'm
sure
I'm ambivalent is what I'm saying.
And look, I mean, the no platforming thing doesn't seem to have done a hell of a lot to keep the right down or anything like that. So there is that too. Yeah. So that's fair play to Dean Buckley. Well done. Yeah, he does great work, and that was a very cool story. But yeah, so the Ditch didn't necessarily get all the credit it deserved on this. Dean and the Ditch, it ended up being an Irish Times story about the Constellation that didn't mention the Ditch, right?
Yeah, but like I guess that's kind of we talk about this stuff, like the boys were like it's kind of like the nature of the game, right? Where it's like you can't really be the guys who are like, oh, we're the big bad Ditch and we're going to publish things that the mainstream won't. And then when the mainstream don't publish our stuff, then we can't cry about it then.
That's right.
It's like, this is what we're supposed to be. Like this is as frustrating as it might be the odd time.
Yeah, for sure. But
you can be a gadfly and send them an annoying email, though.
I'm sure you know about that, Nausicaa, for
Get
sure.
in their hair for a day. Oh, yeah, for sure.
And so you had another story that has an Epstein connection.
Yeah, there's a guy called Eric Fradd, who he's an American theatre director. He's been in Ireland since the early noughties. He was in the Irish Independent last week. He's got this company called The Giant Company, which has this 30-meter statue that's over in Las Vegas. And he was saying that we could have one of these guys in Dublin. We could have this 30-meter high statue. He's had PwC has done the feasibility study on it, and this is what Dublin needs. And
big arts, big events, big spectacle stuff.
Yeah. And Irish Independent, it was one of those. It was a conversation starter,
right?
And we look. He was a guy who had kind of been on our radar as well, because he was. Look, first off, he was in Jeffrey Epstein's 1997 Black Book, which was. This is another address book, separate to the one typically when people refer to as Black Book. It was a later one that was published by Gawker. This was also published by Gawker, but it was verified by Insider. And he had two phone numbers in this 1997 Black Book, which places him in Epstein's circle back in 1997. He also established a theater company called Millennial Productions with Paula Heil Fisher, who's an ex-girlfriend of Epstein's and longtime associate. And throughout the Epstein files that were released by the U.S. Department of Justice, there are these repeated references to him. Now, to be clear, there aren't emails from Eric Fradd to Epstein or back and forth, but there are people in Epstein's circle making these repeat references to, I'm going to see Eric in Paris, or Eric and I are going to be here, and arranging meetings with Epstein that Fradd may have attended, we'll say. But yeah, he this was at a time when he moved to Ireland in the aughts. his first big role in Ireland was as director of a children's theatre in Temple Bar, the Arc Centre, which the 3-year period that Frad was director of this place coincided with big injection of cash from Atlantic Philanthropies, about 500,000 or so over the course of 3 years.
Chuck Feeney's philanthropic organization, which was giving a lot of money around Ireland for a lot of things at that time. Yeah.
And after Frad left, he's kind of been on the Dublin theatre scene since. Paulie called him first on Friday, and he answered the phone and he said, "I'm a journalist. Would you have time to answer a few questions?" And as soon as Paulie said, "I'd like to speak to you about your relationship with Jeffrey Epstein," he was like, "Can I call you back in 20 minutes?" And he hung up the phone, didn't call back. And we repeatedly called him over the next few days. And just before we were publishing, I was calling him. We published on Tuesday. I was calling. And next thing is my phone starts ringing and I say Eric Frad, and like he'd R-styled me. No, I was there on the phone with him for about 10 minutes, and I was going, Eric, hello, Eric. I was texting him, "Can you hear me, Eric?" I was like, "Right, fine. Will you comment on your relationship with Jeffrey Epstein?"
God, so he said nothing incriminating even by accident during that time, it must be said, right? So we've had no comment, in other words.
No comment from
Eric Frad. And, and obviously a lot of people are in Jeffrey Epstein's black books and social circle and all those things. Yeah, we know that. But, a lot of people have had to come out in public and say that what they were doing there or what they weren't doing there, et cetera. And he hasn't yet.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay.
All right.
Okay.
So
well,
we'll
thanks
move on,
for those two stories from the ditch, Eoghan. Maybe we should turn now to looking at our non-ditch media story. So
we have a thing where we talk about the NDM every week, the non-ditch media, and it's usually kind of like something we're kind of pissed off about or we want to complain about, and it's usually some liberal that has annoyed us. But this time we thought we would actually use the opportunity of having Nausicaa with us to talk about journalism that we really like, published in no less a site than Dropsite News itself.
I'd like to say that I tried to email Harry and say that I would prefer to hate read something with you all because that sounds much more fun. But
well, we can hate on the people that the story is about. How about that, Nausicaa? Can we go for it?
Sure.
Let's give it a try anyways. So this was a really interesting story about Canary Mission. And maybe if you wouldn't mind, before we get into the specific things that are revealed here about Canary Mission, you might tell us what Canary Mission actually is and the effects that it's had in American society and politics and culture.
Of course. So Canary Mission is a site that's been around for quite a number of years. It is completely secretive. It has no apparent evidence of who funds it or who runs it, and for a long time it's sort of lived in the darkness of shell organizations. And its job basically is to dox activists or people who are making public statements that the writers on this site deem to be anti-Semitic. So they will go, last year they went after a lot of like pro-Palestinian student activists posting their names, what they said, and any kind of personal details about them. And it is used as like a way to incite harassment against these people and to try to get them fired from their jobs. There was a lawsuit recently filed in Illinois against them by 6 defendants, and there have been a lot of basically alleging harassment over what should be their free speech rights. So it's been a very controversial group in the US because they'll pop up at moments when activism is really at its height and sort of start to viciously come after people.
Yeah, and it came after academics very heavily for a time, and as you say, then students over the last couple of years, and then in particular targeting foreign students in the last
Yeah,
while.
I
And
mean,
that,
there was a
yeah,
related group called Betar that was specifically targeting students also, and many of them with the aim, with the new Department of Homeland Security trying to target people specifically for deportation. So they were trying to flag to the U.S. government when there were people with political views that they disagreed with to have their cases examined by DHS. I should say, like, this also exists in a much broader ecosystem where you also have, former IDF or former IDF related people sort of going after Palestinian journalists, trying to get the attention of people in power online so that they can place targets on specific people's backs.
right. And those targets are noted and taken up, of course, by the state. This is not just
Right.
a question of getting kind of gangs on Twitter to attack people. This is in the hope that institutions, not just the state, but institutions now, especially with the Trump administration, including Department of Justice and ICE, et cetera, to go after people who turn up on the databases that they create.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
And for a number of years, the people behind this group have been completely invisible, unlike some of the other groups involved who have used their names. People have been chipping away for years trying to find out exactly what the chain of connections are behind Canary Mission. And as you're referencing, DropSite made a pretty big leap toward understanding who's behind it. This week, we published a piece by Jacqueline Sweet, and really it was a matter of document hunting. Canary Mission has gradually become with the association with another group called Megamat Shalom, which is based in Israel, has come to light slowly. And basically what we did was we ended up requesting records in Israel that then the equivalent of like the 990 in Israel that then allowed us to see in the way that you would on a 990, like who are the highest paid people. And it revealed a network of folks who are, American citizens who moved to Israel and then were paid, a normal salary, like $90,000 to create content for Megamat Shalom. But Megamat Shalom's main thing that they do is support Canary Mission. So we had a story this week that was like meet the top 5 writers for Canary Mission.
Right. So for the first time, names put to this work, and there's an Epstein connection, right?
Is there an Epstein connection?
Well, the Wexner Foundation, that the highest paid employee of the throughout that period is associated with the Wexner Foundation, has written for the Wexner Foundation blog, et cetera. And Les Wexner, of course, the kind of sponsor over the years of Jeffrey Epstein. Indeed, Epstein himself, a trustee for a time of the same foundation. So just while we're doing Epstein stories, it's obviously not the main thing that Canary Mission
well,
is.
it's interesting, like with covering the Epstein thing, because, when you're thinking about like, is there a connection with Epstein or is there not? I don't know if you ever faced this, Eoghan, but it's sometimes, I like to think of it less as like connected to one shady figure as like, there's an entire world that sort of enabled this kind of behavior for elites.
Yeah, exactly. Epstein is almost just a term now that we slap on. The term Epstein class is one that we were discussing here recently, that kind of a shorthand for the corruption of a whole set of elites. And obviously, that has this connection with both kind of American and Israeli propaganda systems as well.
I kind of like that way of looking at it. I think it's Whitney Webb has called it transnational like like a transnational elite.
That's right.
It's kind of the best way of thinking
A
about
Davos set.
of that. Yeah. Of that whole Epstein class, like that.
Yeah.
That nationalist, not in any ways that we would understand nationalism conventionally, but to a transnational, a transnationalism, if there is, something of that driving those politics.
I mean, as has been pointed out, Epstein in some of his correspondence is somewhat contemptuous of various nations, including Israel. That he, although obviously he's very well connected in Israel, including with the former prime minister, he was kind of a cosmopolitan. We saw recently the big Le Monde story about his apartment in Paris. This incredible place that he had there. He was part of a genuinely globe-trotting elite. Now, we're not by any means suggesting that these Canary Mission writers are in that necessarily in that category or in that class. It doesn't appear that way. They're making 60 grand a year, 90 grand a year, writing Instagram posts about members of my family, in fact, have been targeted by Canary Mission for their activism on American campuses. So it's a slightly sub-Epstein level of activity for sure, but nonetheless part of that wider nexus of kind of control and of surveillance, you might say.
Yeah, I mean, I think we really wanted to turn the lens on them for the reason that, like, their elevation of, it's just a student. Like, it's, this isn't, they're attacking people who are really, regular workaday people. And the idea that they can turn those people into targets while remaining like off screen themselves. I mean, yeah, I agree that it's not the same level as Epstein's crimes, but on the other hand, like, it's part of the whole the world that Epstein loved and lived in, which is that, like, his enemies get attacked while he get some impunity, which of course was not the case by the end. But that was the world he lived in for a long time.
I like that kind of who doxes the doxers thing, and that's kind of maybe brings us to talking maybe more broadly about what Dropsite News is and does. That this story is kind of an example of in a sense going after a bunch of bullies and exposing them for who they are and what they are. So maybe you'd tell us a bit more about kind of where that fits into the larger philosophy of Dropsite News. You're one of the founding editors, of course. Our listeners will be familiar, I'm sure, with many of your colleagues there, Jeremy Scahill and Brian Grimm, most notably. So what is Dropsite News?
Yes, I'm the invisible third co-founder, as a typical editor who likes to remain behind the scenes, and you've somehow gotten to be on camera. I mean, when we founded Dropsite back in like July 2024, we had a very simple idea. I mean, we really weren't sure if it was going to be successful, which was that people really we felt that people were really craving real information. Just based on our experience in the news so far, we felt like the world of analysis and opinions and takes was completely saturated and had kind of moved beyond print media, truly, and that we needed a return to something like just providing new reporting that people weren't getting elsewhere. It was a bad idea in the sense that foreign desks everywhere were closing because Americans allegedly aren't interested in foreign policy, and having bureaus everywhere is not a sustainable business model. And those are always like the least read pieces. But, we really felt like there was a big hole in terms of what, Americans especially, but people across the world were able to get in terms of on the ground reporting from places where the U.S. is engaged in support for, I'm thinking of the genocide in Gaza, where, the U.S. is backing a terrible conflict, and people are getting news primarily from their Twitter feeds about this. So we basically decided to start a news organization that would try to publish reporting that was not being received or not being published elsewhere. So, the first thing that we ever published was called On the Record with Hamas, and it was interviews with Hamas officials by Jeremy Scahill, and it was like 6,000 or 8,000 words, I think. And it was nobody in the mainstream media for sure was talking to them, and nobody in the left media really was either. It felt like they're not hard to talk to, like it wasn't like we had some amazing, I mean, of course, Jeremy's an amazing reporter, but it wasn't like we had some kind of secret formula to getting in touch. It was more like it's so taboo to hear from the other side of an American war or American-backed war while the war is going on. And I think we very quickly saw how much people really craved this. And, I was talking to my partner earlier, and he was saying, you guys have a really aggressive style of reporting. It's like, I don't even like to think about it as aggressive. It's just like when you say doxing, the doxers, doxing is I don't have a great association with doxing, but I do think it's we wanted to basically catch up what reporting on the left and in the, I wouldn't even say we're necessarily on the left, but in the independent space. We wanted to create a really competitive news organization that was very independent from mainstream sources. And I think we've accomplished that. Sorry, about the Canary Mission piece in particular. I mean, I think it's a really good example of a particular thing that would be very difficult to publish at many other places, actually. Despite the fact that you might see somebody on a stream going through these 990s and or 990-esque things and exposing people behind Canary Mission, or you might see it on Twitter, some OSINT account, basically feeling really free to write about things that are online connections that they've surfaced. But I think that especially investigative journalism has become mainstream investigative journalism, nonprofits that spend all their time doing months-long investigations have become too careful and too slow in terms of what they feel comfortable publishing. I mean, I don't know exactly what the source of that is, but we wanted to speed that process up a little bit and get a little less, I wouldn't say a little less careful because we're very careful, but a little less worried about making a splash. I think news organizations are very hesitant to make a splash sometimes.
I think that's very true of American news organizations and those long investigations that end up being a little bit kind of staid in the end and just kind of it's the Pulitzer application rather than something that goes straight to the heart of the story.
Exactly.
And that idea that, you find a bit of something online and you go with it, it's kind of a ditch model as well, isn't it, Eoghan?
Yeah.
No, I feel very identified with you all as well.
No, for sure. I mean, yeah, what Nausicaa said there is pretty so much of it is what we try to make that our philosophy as well. One of the words that I tend to use a lot, stories that we don't end up publishing, we kind of go, that's a bit soft. And I find a lot of Irish media soft, where even some of the Irish investigative stuff I also find can be just very, worthy. And it's oh, great. Yeah. This is very worthy. And it's very lovely. It's very, also, oftentimes I find that they can be almost a little bit more taken with the process than the actual story, and kind of very proud of all these processes that they go through. Whereas Yeah, like some of our best stories, I've joked with Roman, who I work with, about some of the stuff that he's produced for us, some of our best stuff. Like, and I would slag him a little bit, going like, that wasn't exactly the most glamorous work that you've ever done, and he'd be like, no, that was just like, like finding something online and going, yeah, and like the other thing that we do is, like Tom Cruise in Risky Business, like sometimes you've just got to say what the fuck, like, and like. Careful, yeah, but also sometimes it's just about pulling the trigger and seeing what works.
My kind of mentor in journalism was Alex Coburn, and he used to say that like journalistic responsibility should be a little bit of an oxymoron. That you kind of have to put the facts out there and let the chips fall where they may. And Niamh, I know that you would have found Dropsite like over the course of the genocide in particular to be like an incredibly valuable site that you would have gone back to follow what was actually going on there.
Yeah, and actually that was one of the questions that I was going to ask. Was you mentioned a little bit about the on the ground reporting that you were doing, because so many media outlets were kind of talking about Gaza without speaking to people who were actually in Gaza. So maybe you can talk to us a little bit about how you were able to get people in Gaza reporting their stories with you, and how that process actually worked.
Sure, yeah. I mean, first of all, the U.S. media's behavior toward Palestinian journalists has been absolutely shameful. I mean, you have multiple cases where people had used photographers or journalists in Gaza, and then, prior to the war, and then stopped using them, and then, didn't defend them against allegations by the IDF. And they've basically allowed an enormous number of journalists to be killed. We basically, the person behind that at Dropsite is Sharif Abdel Qaddus, who's our Middle East desk editor, and he very quickly was able to find journalists working on the ground there. And I think the main, the model that many U.S. organizations have, or what's, would be called parachute journalism, where you go in and you have your fixer, but you do the reporting yourself. And your fixer translates and basically does all the work of putting you in touch with people, but then the American gets the byline. And, it's a very outdated model for many reasons, but one of them being that, we have the resources and the context to be in touch with people on the ground directly and sort of cut out the American journalist from that model, and to say, we will pay like a US rate for a story by somebody who might have been kind of sidelined if US journalists were allowed in. And it also has required like a lot of translation work in the moment. I mean, Sharif will translate, the reporter on the ground may send us interviews that they've done, videos of those interviews, and but they won't have like a computer necessarily to go sit down and like put it all together. So we basically do a lot of the stitching together of the story. Well, it works differently with different people. And then we sort of post the videos of the interviews as well, so that people can see exactly what the reporter is seeing on the ground. Yeah.
And of course, with the reality that so many journalists have been killed, targeted in Gaza, and knowing that the people that you're in touch with may also be targeted because they're doing that work alongside.
Yeah, one of our contributors just over a year ago, Hossam Shabbat, was killed he was targeted in a strike. Hours after Sharif was like in the middle of an edit on a story with him. Yeah.
And of course, one of those journalists has made it to Ireland. Abu Bakr, who's a friend of the show, has done events with the Ditch previously, and has fortunate enough to, and we're fortunate enough to have him here. Maybe we'll transition from talking about Dropsite in particular to talking about American politics. But maybe I'll ask you the question by way of saying, how does Dropsite deal with the fact that, politicians, officials, et cetera, will often come out and say, this Iranian associated website, this Hamas associated website, this Hezbollah loving website, because it so happens that you actually write stories in which you talk to Iranians, Hamas people, and Hezbollah, but you are constantly being identified by, and not just by commentators, but by officials as a kind of virtually a sponsor of terrorism. So how does Dropsite negotiate the American political scene, and particularly what we might see as an increasingly repressive American political scene?
I don't know if we negotiate it. I mean, we kind of let them say what they're going to say. If they want to audit us, that's fine. Like, they can audit us and see that we get no money from any foreign government. It would be quite easy to determine that. I mean, in general, I just think it's really telling that that publishing really basic political statements from another country is seen as like some kind of unheard of propaganda. But it's also telling because, all those people are forced to read us too. We have so much information that we know makes it to the Pentagon and the White House, that we're there sort of reading our stories to understand what the Iranian perspective is. So it's sort of this funny thing where, they come out against us pretty virulently, and like, we are definitely always watching for that. But on the other hand, I think that we've succeeded in making ourselves a bit indispensable for those very same people.
Right. And I like that you're not trying to make yourselves a hero for standing up to it. You're just doing your jobs, right? But do you worry? Do you worry about do you worry about the direction that it's going, that it might become more difficult? Is that something you discuss among yourselves?
Difficult in the sense that we would become legal targets?
Sure.
I mean, there's a range of things there's a range of risks to the type of reporting we do, and we're always thinking about them. I think we all have a very high tolerance for that risk and feel that we know how to manage it. But there's information security risks, there's legal risks. Owen Jones was sued in the UK for an article that we published. And that has, fingers crossed, been successfully batted down in the UK court, although they've indicated they're going to file an appeal. And then there's the issue of nonprofit status in the US. And, that was a big concern of mine when Trump came into office, but I don't know that we would be necessarily the number one target of that, because we're quite small in comparison. Although Laura Loomer is sure doing her best to train a target on our back at this point.
Right, and she does have his ear. But yeah, it's interesting you say that.
There's just a bit more bark than bite, I guess, is what I'm trying to say in general.
That idea that Trump's real enemies are just the mainstream liberal publications and networks, et cetera. They're the ones, of course, that his supporters are quite successfully taking over at the moment is an interesting point. And of course, borne out by the fact that it's, the guy that just failed to take a shot at Trump seems to have been basically MSNBC coded politics. Nothing. He's not reading Dropsite News or The Ditch.
It's always funny when these guys come out.
That's true. I mean,
Yeah. He's our reader or he's not our reader.
Yeah. And everyone tries to go through old tweets, and then they'll seize upon, look, he liked or didn't like Hassan Piker, or he liked or didn't like X, Y, or Z conservative commentator. But oftentimes, they're all just inscrutable politics, right?
I think that's been true of a few of them. Yeah, sorry, go on, Nausicaa, yeah.
Oh, I I was just going to say, like, initially I was sort of surprised to see that, like, a blue sky, liberal seeming sort of guy was I haven't done a deep dive on his politics, so, don't repeat me without doing your research. But initially I was sort of surprised to see him be named as the would-be assassin. But I think it's a real symptom of the flaws of the democratic analysis, the liberal democratic analysis of what's wrong in the country, because they pin everything on Trump. Like, they say, like, if Trump just went away, we would have a return to democracy and a return to everything good, a return to law and order. And I think when you locate the issue in just a single person, this is the kind of thing that happens, no?
Well, we've kind of had that a bit with kind of being told, when you question the direction that the world is going in, and it's kind of even the stuff that came up with Greenland a few months back, and it was kind of, well, just hold tight and there'll be elections in a few years and then Trump will be gone, and just kind of centering everything on this one person, this one figure, and not taking into account that there's a whole structure and architecture around him that's allowing this. And yeah, we've seen that even just at an event I went to last week in Trinity College, where a number of the speakers kind of came onto that level as well, that we just need to hold tight and, don't break relations with the US and don't get the US military out of Shannon, and just, sit tight. He'll be gone in 2 years or whatever. And then we'll just go back to normal, which is not exactly a pretty picture either.
Yeah, and so what's normal? What is normal? I mean, and as you say, there's the kind of, on the one hand, there's the kind of catastrophist, we've got to do something about Trump, and there's also the if you like, more relaxed version of, if we just hold tight. And that seems to be almost the European Union policy now, that we hold tight and wait for him to go. But there are deeper structural issues, including in the Republican Party, which is partly what you've been writing about yourself lately and reading about too, Nausicaa, isn't it? The state of the Republican Party.
State of the Republican Party, yes. Well, what you're referring to is a book review that I did of Rogue Elephant by Paul Heidemann for the New Left Review. And Paul, if I may, has an interesting thesis about, he looks at the history of the US and the kind of convergence and divergence of corporate interests and Republican interests over, mostly since the late 19th century. And it's interesting. He basically thinks that, I don't know how you would characterize it, Harry, but something about how the Republican Party the corporate class has kind of folded to the Republican Party in a certain sense, that that Trump is this chaotic leader who has sort of disrupted the hold of corporations on the U.S.
And it's kind of, it's been, instead of being a kind of a well-oiled machine that runs for the American ruling class, it's now a kind of just a machine to enrich Trump and his associates.
That's right. Yeah. I mean, I as I wrote in my review, like, I think it's a bit of an open question, actually, but it's a very fascinating question to think through. Because to my mind, capitalism absolutely benefits from a large degree of chaos. But, it's hard not to think about these things in the context of the Iran war now, where the markets are such an important piece of the war that are basically being controlled by the Iranians because of the Strait of Hormuz. And you don't really have that much of a corporate revolt against Trump, I guess, because he's giving them so many little pieces of candy on the side. I don't know. How do you see it?
That makes a lot of sense, actually. And the idea that, that chaos at this point in the kind of dissolution of Western society's chaos is fine. They're still coining it. Yeah. And war and kind of, I mean, Trump, of course, famously elected in opposition to never-ending war, is now just kind of adopted that. And literally the Iran war now seems like it may just go into kind of a holding pattern that could be around for a long time.
Yeah, that seems to be the case. I mean, at this point, if we had to make a prediction, I think it would have to be that there will be, or the Iranians really are predicting that there won't be a real deal that we end up with. It'll be sort of a slow stop to the fighting, and a very different situation than we were in before. I don't think that Trump entered the war wittingly. I think he was saying at the very beginning that he expected it to be over and done with, in the same way that Venezuela, removing Maduro from Venezuela happened. Of course, anybody with 2 eyes and 2 ears would know that it was going to last longer than that, because Iran is a very different situation. But I think we can assume that Trump was being told quite the opposite.
Well, we know this episode is coming out on May Day, and it brings me back to this kind of question of the working class then. And to a huge extent, for some commentators in recent years anyway, including some who used to be on the left, there's been a decision that actually there is now a working class party in the United States. It's a white working class party, but it's a working class party, and it's the Republicans. And that the so-called national conservatism on behalf of a kind of a reindustrialized America and on behalf of a more isolationist foreign policy, supposedly personified by the formerly working class Vice President J.D. Vance, was going to be in the ascendant and bring a different kind of politics to the top of that party. That's not looking particularly coherent at the moment, isn't it?
No, I mean, I don't think that the U.S. has a class politics in the way that one would traditionally think about class politics. When we're talking about this, the quote unquote white working class, we're talking about a very small number of people, relatively speaking, who are enabled to be who decide the presidency, perhaps, and retain control of Congress because of redistricting and because we're talking about such small margins of votes making the difference. But, those people are not, I wouldn't say that they're voting on class issues. They're voting on culture war issues and things of that ilk. They're not voting on Medicare for All, for instance, which has majority support in the US, but doesn't even enter into national politics at this particular stage.
Right. And so there's no sign of a coherent Republican movement of either a national conservative or a neoconservative sort in the aftermath of Trump. We're already, on behalf of the expectant widow, Melania, we're already thinking him gone.
I mean, I think the midterms will give us some information about where things are headed post-Trump.
You think there will be midterms?
I think there will be midterms. You don't think there will be midterms?
We just
Are
never
things
know.
evolving that quickly?
It's always good to, because I haven't been back in the States myself for a while, so it's always good. My mother is a bit of a catastrophist herself, and I think she's not convinced at all that she's going to vote again, and not only because she's about to turn 91 years old, but because there's not going to be any voting anymore.
Yeah, I'm not at that point of concern in terms of the midterms. I think there's enough money being pumped into those things now that they have to happen.
They're self-generating.
Fair enough.
Yeah. It's an entire economy.
Nausicaa, it's been great talking to you. Thank you so much for joining us on the Party Line.
Oh, thank you. It's
Today,
been great.
we're going to call it a podcast. Everyone should shout down the Party Line by emailing theditchpartyline@gmail.com. You should go to Dropsite News. You should go to ontheditch.com. You should donate and subscribe at both those places. Am I right, Owen?
Absolutely.
Yeah. And we'll leave it at
I
that.
think that's it. Thanks a million, Nausicaa, and thanks, Owen, for joining us.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So much.
Bye-bye.